Bentley here. Good evening to you. On behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub, I welcome you to A Climate of Change, our weekly live cast exploring with thought leaders from across Canada what this wildly unprecedented moment in history means for our province, this country, the economic system, and specifically the climate crisis. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play in the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Yaqsi Nakota Nations, the Métis Nations of Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. I'd like to also make a second land acknowledgement on behalf of another group of folks that have a stake in this land that we stand on today, and that is our children, our nieces and nephews and grandchildren, and all future generations. I urge you to keep them in mind during this time as we face unprecedented change and start making decisions about what comes next. For those of you watching tonight via Facebook Live or via the Zoom cast, feel free to send questions. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for the Zoom, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Should you wish for me to not say your name, please type the word anonymous before your question, as this show will be shared to our social networks. Otherwise, we'll assume your consent in the use of your name in the broadcast. Tonight's guests are Celia Lee and Dr. Noel Keough of Sustainable Calgary, an organization that has been in the trenches of the sustainability effort in this city for 2 decades now. They've just released their State of Our City 2020 report, a comprehensive work providing metrics across a wide array of domains that lays out under no uncertain terms that Calgary must transition, and transition quickly. Sustainable Calgary, welcome to A Climate of Change.
Thank you.
Nice to be here, Steve.
Okay, well, why don't you tell us a little bit about the high points of the high and perhaps low points of the report?
Okay, can I share my screen and I'll go
Surely.
through slides to get us going. Won't be too long. Okay, let me see how I can manage that. Host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Oh, let's see. So let's see about. Hopefully we can. I'll just send a message. So to my producer Shay, it looks like the host has disabled screen share. I will assume that she'll be able to get into that. It should be available now.
Okay.
Perfect.
Let me find. How's that? We got it?
Good.
Okay. Okay, so I'm Noel, in the Noel and Celia pair, and I'm just going to take you through just a couple of minutes of an overview of our State of Our City 2020 report. So this is the 5th report that we've done since 1998. Steve said we've been around a little bit over 20 years, really inspired by the Rio Earth Summit back in 1992 to do something at a local scale, local level in our own city about sustainability. I'm going to go through the slides and just try to give you an overview of the highlights and kind of the findings, and just a snippet of just a selection of the 40 indicators that we've been tracking to get things going tonight. So the subtitle of our report is An Urgent Call for a Just Transition. So as I said, we've been tracking this data for over 20 years, and I think what's abundantly clear in this 2020 version of the report is that we haven't made a big dent in the sustainability challenge in our city, and thus at this point in time, I think it becomes very urgent to do just that, and for all kinds of reasons, none more so than the current crisis or the current event that's capturing the news these days, Black Lives Matter. A just transition is an important thing here. It's not just a sustainability transition, but a just sustainability transition. The bottom line, I guess, for our report is the lifestyle that we enjoy in Calgary, though it is a high quality of life for many Calgarians, is less sustainable than it was 22 years ago. That's what our data that we've been tracking is telling us, unfortunately. And as a result of that, and the 20 years that we've been doing this work, we've really come to the conclusion in the report that it's kind of lost decades in terms of action on sustainability. And the key point that we want to make, or we do make in the report, is that the inability to turn policy into action is what our problem is. We have had all kinds of really good policy on the books over the last 20 to 25 years in our city. If we followed that policy, then we'd be in a lot better shape than we are now. The problem is that we don't turn it into action. And most obviously, the problem is that that policy does not find its way into budgets. And without budgets, without dollars, nothing can happen. So that's kind of the conundrum that we see, we find ourselves in the city. So again, the problem is not policy, it's been backing up policy with intention, i.e. budgets and work plans, to allocate resources to actually make the policy happen. We do want to highlight also in the report that Calgary, we're a part of a global village. And over the past 75 years, in the period that many people are referring to now as the Anthropocene, the nature of our economic and social relationships with the planet have become untenable socially, ecologically, and economically. Relations within the global village have become more unequal, more unfair, and the climate and biodiversity crises have increased in severity as well. So it's not a great picture from that perspective. I think that's why we're calling for an urgent transition. But we do have the tools to make a change, and we think that we do have to move from laggards to leaders. And these are some of a 9-point agenda, if you will, or points that we've identified in the analysis of our indicators that give us a sense of where we have to go. And I think we need to recognize as a city that while fossil fuels built our city, our future is elsewhere. We don't seem to have gotten that message quite clearly yet, but I think that's something that we have to acknowledge and to begin to make changes based on that assertion. Care for the most vulnerable first. I think that's become front and center. We've seen this in the crises we're in the midst of now. You can see it in the indicators. You get a chance to look at the report. But what we're saying is in this time of transition, number one, above all, is that we have to make sure that we're taking care of the most vulnerable. Also, we're calling for a steady state economy. We don't think that the idea of economic growth has really done what it needs to do for us. That above all, what we need is a fair and just economy that allows us to live within our means economically and, more importantly, ecologically. And as many people, Herman Daly, for one, the ecological economist, tells us, growth is now uneconomic. So we think we need to commit to redesigning our economy to focus squarely on well-being and to retool planning for the transition to a healthy, sustainable, circular, relocalized economy. These are the kind of phrases that we're hearing these days. And to resist the temptation to dismantle the systems that are the foundation of our well-being. Again, this is front and center in the debates in our province, in our city these days, but we have very good health and education systems. This is not the time, in a time of transition or entering into a transition, to dismantle those. This is the time to bolster those, because they are the supports that are going to be the foundation for us being able to make that transition. And we need to build a city where walking, biking, and public transit are the norm, and the private automobile is a tertiary mode. I think many people have said, I would concur, that the private automobile is one of the most destructive technologies that we've devised and put into use around the planet. And I think we seriously have to take a look at how we deploy this automobile in our cities in particular. But we do have a growing youthful design culture and expertise endowed from those years of prosperity. So we need our buildings, our neighborhoods, our transportation systems, the entire city and the region that we live in to be designed for sustainability. And at the same time, we need to continue to welcome new people, new ideas, new energy from all corners of the world that are going to help us to make our lives better and to help us in this transition. And finally, we need to get our political house in order. We'll see some of this in a couple of the indicators, and restore trust in our systems of governance, get money out of politics, reinvent our democracy with fairness at the core. So those are some of the things that we're saying are key to moving into this transition that we call for. And what I want to do now is just run quickly through a selection of those 40 indicators to give you a sense of where we're at. The first one I put up is person and property crime. We've been following for 20 years. And you can see that for a long time, for over 20 years, or close on 20 years, we have had significant decreases in crime in our city, which has been a great thing. Over the past 4 or 5 years, we're seeing that we've got an uptick. We're still in pretty good shape, but probably the economic circumstances that we're finding ourselves in now are leading to a little bit of an increase in crime. So that's a concern for us. Calgary's oil and gas reliance index. So we talk about diversification of the economy. The city, the province has been talking about diversification for 20 years. What this graph shows is that we devised an index which is comprised of the direct jobs from that industry, the contribution to our city's GDP that industry makes, and the contribution to provincial exports that industry makes. And as you can see by the graph, there is no sense of a decrease in reliance on oil and gas in the time that we've been tracking this indicator. So again, a flag for us to be concerned about. With all the talk of diversity, we don't seem to be, at least through this indicator, moving in that direction. Weekly hours required to meet basic needs at minimum wage. Now the graph here is trending in a positive direction. That is the number of hours an individual, single parent with 2 kids in Calgary would have to work to just make what's considered the poverty line has been going down. Thing to note here is that it is still 55 hours a week that single parent with 2 children would have to work at minimum wage just to reach the poverty line, the very basics. So has been trending in the right direction, but we haven't been there for a long time and we're still not there yet. Income gap ratio in Alberta is another interesting one. And what we talk about a lot in the indicator report is the importance of equity and equality as opposed to pure growth or affluence. And you can see this is divided into the decades over the past 5 decades. And the 1970s to the 1990s were a significant decrease in equity or an increase in that ratio between the top 20 earners in our city and the bottom 20 earners. We've seen a little bit of improvement over the 20s and the 2000s, but we're still not back to the 1970s. And one of the things here that's interesting to think about in the big conversation about where we're going as a city is that the 1970s kind of lands us in that period where people talked about a real transition in our economy at a global level and what people call neoliberalism. And that was the period of time where we decided really that the markets should do everything. We don't need government intervention or participation in the economy. We can just turn everything over to the markets. And I think the argument that we make and can be seen in our indicators is that was probably a mistake and has led to a lot of different problems, including this growing gap between the rich and the poor in that period of time. On the positive side, Calgary Public Library use. We have one of the best used systems, and I think people would probably agree, a high world-class system of public libraries in our city. And that's one of those education anchors that we're going to need to support our transition into the future. Unearned seat average, we get to the idea of governance here. The important bars to look at here is the black bars, which are the seats that the winning party in Alberta, this is for federal election results, and it's the results for the dominant party. And in our case, that has been the Conservative Party in Alberta over that period of time. But you can see that the seats for the winning party have been in the range of 90 to 95% for every election since 1997, but the votes for that winning party have been in the 60 to 65, 70 maybe percent range. So you can see a real disparity between the percentage of votes, the percentage of Calgarians that say yes to the dominant party versus the number of seats that dominant party gets. This is repeated in provincial elections. It's repeated across the board in every province federally and repeated in every province provincially. And in terms of getting our governance right, this is a big problem. Average campaign spending, again, getting money out of politics. This was a really telling piece of data that we came to in this report. In 2007, the winning councillors spent on average $45,000 in their campaigns for city elections. In 2017, the winning councillors spent an average of $184,000. That's a sign of dollars playing a larger role in politics, and it's not a good thing. Number of community gardens. Here again, we have a really positive, obvious trend over time. We've got 200 plus community gardens now, and given this COVID crisis, I'd imagine that that's going to uptick a lot this summer. But we've seen a tremendous increase in the number of people that are growing their own food. And this plays out in farmers markets in all kinds of ways too, but a really positive food trend in our city and awareness of urban agriculture and the need to grow more of our food. Water consumption, another really positive indicator. And we can see since 1984, the city has had a strategy to reduce our consumption, and they've done a really good job of reducing the consumption. And you can see that in this indicator. So a really positive example of how government can make a difference. Energy consumption. Again, you can see this is taking our heat energy, our automotive gasoline energy, our electricity, rolling it all into the equivalent of barrels of crude oil. And what you can see here again is that there is no trend towards the reduction of average energy consumption in our province. And this plays right into, of course, the increase in CO2 per capita production that goes along with energy consumption. So a real problem here, especially for all you folks who are interested in climate change. Population density, this is an interesting one in that this is measuring how compact our city. Are we growing our city more compact? Are we getting a handle on sprawl? Now you can see over the last 30 years that in fact we've been creeping up in terms of density. That is making our city a little bit more compact, which is a good thing. But the interesting thing is if you look back at 1951, we've got a long way to go to get to where we were in the 1950s. And the 1950s is interesting because that's the pre-car era. So what this graph over time is showing you is the impact of making cities, building cities for cars rather than building cities for people. Ecological footprint. This is a really important indicator of our gross consumption as a city. Now, how many resources on the planet do we require to live the way that we do? And I'd focus your attention on the right-hand side of the graph where that highest gold bar, 12.4 hectares per person, is Calgary. Canada, on average, is only 8 hectares per person. I say only 8 hectares per person. But if you look at the middle of those 5 charts there on the right-hand side, the fair share is 1.7. What fair share means is that if you take all of the productive land on the planet, you divide it by the number of people on the planet, there are approximately 1.7 hectares of productive land per human for the planet. Now, if Calgary is using 12.4 hectares to live as we do, obviously there's a lot of people in the world that are using far less than even 1.7 hectares to try to eke out a living on the planet. So this really calls into question not only energy consumption, but the entire consumption and the consumptive affluent way of life that we have in Calgary that I think the indicators demonstrate is quite problematic. Funding for preventative health care. This is another interesting one that we've really looked at over the last several years that Celia can say some more about. We've focused on health and the built environment and health and sustainability. But what this graph shows you is that even though since the 1970s at the provincial and federal level consistently, health policy has pointed to the need to move towards preventative care. We don't want to be dealing with and spending our health dollars on dealing with sickness. We want to avoid sickness. But what this graph is showing us is, again, at a provincial level, we have not really moved the bar in terms of how much of our health budget we put into preventative care. And in fact, it's hovering way below 4% on an annual basis. And this is one of those health indicators. This is youth from 12 to 17 years old. And one of the outcomes of not looking at preventative care, one of the outcomes of sprawl, one of the outcomes of car dependency is obesity. And you can see the data is kind of scratchy over time, but in Calgary, in Alberta, and across Canada, you can see an obvious upward trend since 2005 in this case to today for that data. So it gives you a sense, again, of some of the health indicators that we're dealing with and the future for our kids and healthy lifetimes for these kids. So just to close up, we did want to nod to the pandemic. So what we see in our report, we've done this report over a couple of years and now the pandemic has hit us, but the pandemic to us reinforces the urgency to act on the recommendations contained in our report and improve social equity, protect ecological integrity, create an inclusive, resilient economy, and act decisively on climate change. It only heightens the need to take those actions. So thanks, Steve. I guess, do I share back or do you just take over the screen again?
I think, yeah, it looks like Shay's got that managed. Okay, awesome. Thanks for that, Noel. That's it's a comprehensive report. I've went through it. I've got my copy here. Spilt coffee all over it. That's why you get the hard copy, is so you can take care of it like that. I think it's very timely that we talk to you here just after you've released basically what's a report card for Calgary as far as it relates to sustainability, right at a moment where we're all sort of wondering what kind of post-COVID response is going to be put into place around the world, into cities around the world. And so, I guess the first question that I would ask you is of the, at the end of the report, you're talking about a clear warning on a way forward for the pandemic. What I've been asking each of my guests is, what's the big teachable moment from the coronavirus? And now that question kind of morphs a little bit in that we can also include movements like Black Lives Matter, and to say what are the teachable moments for those of us that have been seeking to make bona fide change on climate and sustainability from these global earth-shaking events that are coming at us all at the same time.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest lessons for me has been that that we're fully capable of taking on complex challenges. And so one thing I've been thinking a lot is this expression of the tiger in the grass versus the tiger in the door, at the door. And we tend to be much better at sort of responding to the tiger at the door, sort of this urgent problem. And we're not as good at thinking about a problem that seems like a little bit more amorphous. So I think in some ways the pandemic has given us, it sort of loaned us some urgency. And then it's given us this situation in which, the federal government has to invest to restart the economy. And so we have this chance to think about, well, what kind of economy do we want, but also more importantly, what kind of communities do we want to create at the same time? So that's been a really big one for me.
Yeah, and I would, I'd second that too. And I think for me, one of the, in response to your question, Steve, I think this pandemic and the response to it has shown that yes, government has a role, it has an important role, and it can help in crisis. It's also shown that we can do this kind of, in a matter of days, weeks, or even days, we completely halted the economy. We completely reoriented the way that we spend, the role of government, and we're managing. There's some hiccups. It's not perfect. There's a lot of people suffering, but we're managing. And this, I think, is a sign that, kind of like Celia said with the tigers in the grass, I think we're in an immediate emergency with COVID, and climate change is going to be a long-term emergency. But COVID shows us that yes, we can do it. If we decide that we need to reorient everything to deal with climate change, we have the capacity to do that.
So the tiger in the grass versus at the door, I hadn't really heard that expression before, but I like it. I feel like with Black Lives Matter, that has been a tiger in the grass for hundreds of years in America, right? And all of a sudden something big happens and the big response comes, and now it's not something that can be refuted or easily batted aside by the status quo. And on the climate front, for that to happen in a way that impacts the world requires disaster. It requires some great big thing that affects multiple countries all at the same time. And so, it's a thing where when I think about the teachable lesson there when it comes to Black Lives Matter, that's the tiger in the grass thing is apt. It gets to a point and then it overflows. But I also feel like the big teachable moment from Black Lives Matter might be the reason that I think that they've been as successful as they have is they went out and they kept going out and they didn't stop going out no matter what got thrown at them. And I think that's how change happens. What are your thoughts?
I guess if I'll jump in with, I think there definitely has to be an element of that in some manner. And you're right, this is, a tiger in the grass for 400 years, and we're finally coming around to it. I think In terms of the work that we're doing in our indicators, there's one, at least one relevant one, and that's the idea of valuing cultural diversity. So one of our indicators that we've looked at is we've looked at 240 odd powers of position and influence in our city. That is all of our elected representatives, boards of directors of the largest non-for-profits, boards of directors of the largest private sector employers. And we've said, does the diversity of that group mirror the diversity of our city? And what we've found, again, consistently over 20 years, right up to this this 2020 report, is that in terms of women, it's not representative. In terms of people of color, it's definitely not representative. In terms of Aboriginal people, it's not representative. And that's been consistent for 20 years. And again, that's a big problem. So I think that's the kind of, I guess, supportive data that we could put out there with Black Lives Matter is, yes, we agree with the message that's coming from Black Lives Matter. It's one of the key conundrums, one of the key challenges or issues that we've had for, as you say, hundreds of years, along with in Canada, very top of the agenda is reconciliation and reconciling with the First Peoples of this nation. And I think one of the things that's consistently been in our work with Sustainable Calgary is that it's not just a matter of bringing on all good technologies and transitioning to renewable energies. If equity is not part of the picture, this is not going to work. And I think that's one of the things that, for me, the Black Lives Matter highlights, that equity has got to be part of this. We've got to come to a reconciliation with people of color, especially in the United States with African Americans. We've got to come to a reconciliation with Indigenous people. We've got to come to a reconciliation with all of the other communities in the globe, which has allowed us, as our ecological footprint indicator shows, to take in way more than our fair share of the Earth's resources to live as we do. We've got to come to some kind of reconciliation with the rest of the people on the planet and establish that sort of equity in order to be able to collectively come to agreement that, yes, we have to make significant steps to deal with climate change, for example.
Yeah. And yeah, what I'd add to that, so when we think about a good set of indicators, we're also thinking about how they speak to the interconnectedness of these issues. So for example, health and transit are related, equity and resource consumption are related. So from the perspective of Black Lives Matter, I think so we can take that issue on its own. And for me, it's from a morals perspective, everyone deserves dignity and respect and love. And so you can start there. But then from there, you can also say, well, actually, inequity is associated with pretty much every social ill we can name. So there's a great book on that called the Spirit,
Spirit Level.
Spirit Level, which tells us that. So equity is good for us on pretty much every single indicator of social well-being. But then from there, also, from my perspective, the road to climate action, the road to becoming a more environmentally sound community is equity. Because the thing is, the more we have equity, the more we can develop collective political will without sort of fearing what change will bring, because we know we have each other's backs. We know that when someone wins, not someone else doesn't lose. The other part of that is that in more equal societies, we consume less. So there's less of that keeping up with the Joneses. And so that's where I also think that the idea of reducing the work week, which they've come up with in New Zealand, is really interesting from a climate change perspective. It's also really interesting from an equity perspective, from a gender perspective. So during this pandemic, we found, for example, that women have been suffering more. They've been working less. But I've been sort of thinking through this, well, there's also this idea that I suppose men are supposed to still go hard at the same time. Well, what if we could all find more of a balance between our family life, our friends' life, our personal life, and our work life?
Yeah, it's amazing, from the 4-day work week to the universal basic income, where all the different sources you're seeing talk about this from around the world. It's the Overton window has totally shifted. I find it amazing. Big picture, is this the moment? Is this what's going to make us begin this transition that we have to do? And on the flip side of that, is this the moment where status quo capitalism kind of gets the kick in the butt that it's always needed, because it has had all that inequity in there? And, you know, I talk about it week in, week out that, you know, there's so many things about our system that is a wet market, that is something that's broken and about to fail, and just takes, you know, what comes next, we don't know, but something, because it's just, our system is rife with broken things. So do you guys get a sense that we're at a moment where, you know, 10 years from now, 25 years from now, we'll all look back and say, that's when it all changed?
Well, I think Noel probably has some really cool stuff to say about this, but one thing I'd say that I felt during the pandemic was this feeling of nobody has ever faced this before. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows what to do necessarily. They don't know what to do. They're experimenting with what to do. But instead of that making me feel bad, I actually felt like, oh, I'm an adult. I'm one of the adults in the room. I get to build the future. So in terms of what will happen, I mean, that's hard to predict, but I think, for me at least, this has given me a sense that we all get to have a say.
Yeah, I would say, for me, it's definitely an opportunity. This moment is an opportunity that I haven't felt we've had before. Whether what will happen, I don't know. But I think for me, the part of it that relates to the pandemic and what's happened with the reaction to it is, I hear a lot more people talking now about, well, we just spent billions and tens and hundreds of billions of dollars. Where did that money come from? So now there's a whole, and that's a whole show on its own, Steve. But I think now there's a whole conversation that's questioning this idea, right? Like, where did that come from? Is that a bad thing? Is that a good thing? Is that, you know, can governments do that? And there's lots of really good commentary that, again, is shifting us back to the idea that government can help us here. We don't have to just give everything over to the private sector. And I think it's also, I mean, I guess I would, I saw I didn't see the interview with Rand, but I did see the interview with Keough, and I thought it was a fantastic interview. And I would also say, right off the bat, go out and buy Keough's book, because it's fantastic in terms of setting the frame of climate change and what are the policy levers that we can do to deal with it. Having said that, I think Rand and Keough still lean on a growth economy and climate and capitalism. I mean, Rand talks about climate capitalism, and I think Keough presumes a capitalist system. But I think, going back to this equity question, we're now at a point where I think the economics is allowing us to rethink that and whether there's a better way. Because I think essentially, you know, I think an analysis of capitalism is that it's a system that you can argue has been good for us, but it requires growth. And I think if you go back to one of our core indicators of ecological footprint, I think it's very hard to sustain the argument that we can continue to grow. We have to find some other way, a steady state economy, equity, less work hours, sharing what work there is, enjoying a more leisure lifestyle that, like Celia says, allowing others who have been marginalized in our economy to pick up some of that work that needs to be done. So I think there's a whole host of things on the economic side that are in play now. And hopefully, after, you know, since the 1970s, it talked about a lot of our indicators. We can go back and see the 1970s, early 1980s was when things started going off the rails. And I think we're at a point now where we're willing to question whether that was a good move 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and if there's something better and something different. And certainly for climate change concerned people, whether we can just be agnostic about capitalism, or whether we really have to challenge the core economic system that is the foundation of this economy or this movement that gets us to something that's challenging climate change and makes this transition possible.
You know, I would add to that. I actually do have a tentative prediction that I think we'll see a more mixed economy. That is my prediction. I actually wrote about this quite a bit, the idea that, so capitalism is supposed to be a market system, but over time it's become an ideology. And so when you have like the market system and civil society and government, they're supposed to be in dialogue with each other and sort of bringing different ideas to the table. But what we've seen over time now is that those three sort of sectors of society are all saying the same thing. They're all saying profit, market, capitalism, solutions will come from the market. And I think what we've seen here over the last few months is the idea that we have other priorities sometimes. Sometimes health is a priority. Maybe we won't have as much of a privatized system for seniors, for example. Maybe housing co-ops would be a really great way to help people through a hard time and have more affordable housing options and have more support while they're at it. So I think what this has done is that I think it's pointed out again that we need to have a more balanced conversation, that a market is just a market. It's not an ideology. It's not a set of values. And that as people, we have choices to make, and an economy is part of that, but it's not all of that. And I think that's where we've sort of, in the last, 2 decades, that's sort of where we've ended up.
So your report talks about how heavily dependent it really identifies how heavily dependent we are on oil and gas in this city, and oil and gas has been hit by a number of things over the last few years, but now all of a sudden with COVID, we saw things like negative oil and stuff like that, and so how much longer do you think we here in Calgary can consider that being what keeps us afloat?
I guess I'll jump in again on, that's, who can predict how these things go up and down. Again, it was good for anybody who saw the Jacquard interview. He had a lot of interesting things to say on that. One of the messages that we've been trying to put out there for 20 years in the 5 reports that we've done, the work that we've done, is that we can't rely on this anymore. We still are reliant, according to our indicator. There's probably other data out there, people could contest that, but we came up with this indicator, and it definitely shows that we've got a problem in terms of moving off of oil and gas and losing dependence on it. So I think we are still dependent on it, but it's to our detriment at this point. I think the lost decades, again, going back to the idea of the lost decades, we've lost the chance to make an easy, slow transition. Mm-hmm. I think now a transition is a crisis event in many ways. We have to move very, very rapidly, and that's not going to be easy. I think it's necessary to come out the other end with some kind of intact civilization and city. But we've lost at least 20 years. We've lost, it was 1988 when Hansen sat in front of Congress and said, we've got a problem here, right? That's 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 35 years ago. So that's been a long time of not doing much. And as that indicator shows, we have not diversified over that period of time. We've dithered, to use that phrase that was put on Paul Martin a few years ago. So I think we need to, and the other thing that I think that we need to come to terms with, again, looking at the climate change problem, our energy consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, and ecological footprint, is that in the midst, it's not just a transition away from carbon producing economies. It's a walking back of our economy to something that's at a scale that our planet can support. Because biodiversity is a huge issue, water is a huge issue. All of these multiple crises are coming at us, and I think so many of them are related to the impact, the pressure that we are putting on this planet that we live on, and that all has to be part of the picture here.
Yeah, my dad's an electrical engineer, and when I ask him some of these questions, he says, well, there are ways that we can produce more sustainable energy. There are ways we can mix those on the grid, but ultimately we need to be consuming less energy. The other thing I'd add to that is that, yes, we do need a transition and we do need to diversify. But often the narrative becomes, but what about jobs? What about people? And so we can't transition at the expense of people. To me, that's sort of counterintuitive also. Like, why are we concerned about climate? Oh, because it's destructive for people. Okay, well, we can't leave people behind. So, there are typically 3 things we can do to help people out when we're going through a transition, when the economy is not as good. We can create more social support. So you talked about a basic annual income. We could do that temporarily during a transition as a test. We could see if we wanted to do that more long-term. The other thing is we invest in infrastructure. we create jobs. And that's sort of, that should be the role of a government when we're going through economic hard times, is they're like, you know, evening it all out. And then the other is diversifying the economy. And then something like reducing the work week actually should be on that list also. And I should mention that in the 1970s, when the rest, was it in the 1970s? When the rest of the world was going through economic hardship, in one community in Mondragon, what they did was they just reduced everyone's work hours, and everyone worked a little bit less, but they got through it, and they got through it better than anywhere else in the world.
So I feel like I'm gifted right now to be able to reach out to some smart people about the important things that are going on right now. The State of Our City 2020 says right on the cover, an urgent call for a just transition. And with the coronavirus in play, a lot of people are starting to use the term just recovery, so that we use this moment to shift towards the things that need doing. And I feel like it's a real opportunity for me to ask the creators of this report, what sorts of jobs and stimulus programs could address some of our failing grades in this report and maybe an easier political sell than others?
Well, I'll jump in again too about, you know, I think Celia talked about infrastructure, and the obvious elephant in the room in the Calgary room these days is the Green Line.
Yep.
Makes perfect sense. I mean, we are one of the most car-dependent cities in North America, in Canada, for sure. We drive more kilometers, we own more automobiles, you know, we produce more of those greenhouse gases. So creating a certain kind of infrastructure. I actually was on a hike today, and I spent some time walking beside the ring road. That wasn't a pretty sight. That's not the kind of infrastructure that we need to invest in. We need to be investing in biking infrastructure, in transit infrastructure, and that creates lots of jobs. We need to stop investing in oil and gas. It's a big boy, can take care of itself. Let's start investing in renewables. So I think that's something significant. The other thing is that I think one of the big transitions to me is we have to get our heads around, let's not spend our money on toys and stuff. Let's spend our money on well-being. And by that I mean, in a very general way, let's stop building bigger houses every time we want a new house. Let's stop buying the biggest truck we can find on the lot. Let's maybe pay a little bit more taxes, and we have better healthcare and better education, for example. That creates jobs, and those kinds of things create jobs without having a heavy burden on the planet. So I think moving away from stuff and moving towards those services and what we do for each other is a great way to transition, without thinking that, my God, we're going to lose all these jobs. No, it's just different kinds of jobs that we can support.
Yeah. This isn't really my area of expertise. There are articles out there. So like the Energy Futures Lab, for example, put out a paper on 5 big ideas for Alberta's economic recovery. So there's a lot of literature out there on what that could mean, but I feel like that's a whole other report in terms of looking at, okay, well, what does it, you know, lithium is one of the examples. Well, what does it mean to mine lithium? Geothermal is on there, and that actually seems, from a sustainability perspective, fairly promising. But I feel like that might be a whole other report on its own that maybe someone wants to take up.
Yeah, I could just make one more comment there, Steve, too, on your question. Just back to transportation and focus on transportation. I think it's the choices we make. So it's a ruse that we don't have enough money for the Green Line, with 3.9 billion, whatever it is. I think always when the city looks at the province, or the city in particular looks at transportation infrastructure and transportation planning, they leave out the single most expensive element of the transportation system, and that's the private automobile. It figures not at all. It's just an assumption that all of these households will spend tens of thousands of dollars a year on private automobiles to make the whole system work. So 1 year's expense of cars will pay for the Green Line. So, I mean, that is one of, I go back to, I said it earlier about the automobile being one of these key technologies that we really have to question. Does it have a role in a climate constrained world of 8 billion people? And economically, I think, if you take the whole picture of our transportation system, put the cars in there, then it starts bringing us to a whole bunch of different questions about what we can or can't afford.
And there was an interesting conversation online, actually. I forget who it was on Twitter had asked the general public, well, what do you see as, the biggest potential for a relaunch? And someone had mentioned, building a train not just to Edmonton, but building one to Banff as well. Yeah. With the idea that, okay, well, we should be able to travel in a way that's more climate friendly. But what that also does is if you're connecting to Banff, that means that everyone who lives at Calgary can get there on a smaller footprint as well and enjoy the outdoors and be active. And that's one thing that, in Alberta, our tourism is very much based on physical activity, which is a good thing. And that also then might make Calgary a very attractive place to be as an employer. Because we are connected and we are connecting to our national parks, which also means we get to our national parks, we have a connection with nature, and we start to fight for it as well.
And if I can kind of go back to Celia's comment about the interconnectedness of all these things, going back to our report and the notion that I talked about in that introduction of money in politics, for example. And this transportation issue. Like when I was out walking today, I saw Ellis Dawn signs up everywhere. They're doing a big part of this construction. There are dozens of humongous trucks and humongous earth movers and all kinds of equipment out there owned by Ellis Dawn. And they put a lot of money into provincial election campaigns. So they are very tight and they take care of their own backs by making sure that they're helping to fund campaigns and swaying the kinds of political possibilities that are put on the table for us at a city level. All of that land at the edges of the ring road, inside the ring road, outside the ring road. This was purchased or wrapped up by developers decades ago. And those developers have been working hard for decades to make sure that land turns into land with a bunch of houses on it. And that's a big part of the reason that you saw that huge jump in contributions to city council campaigns, because the development industry has a stake in things being and staying the way they are, and in our transportation staying the way it is. And these are some of the hurdles that I think we have to come to terms with, is how do we take back our politics and democratize our politics? Because without the proper decision-making structures, without the people that represent us in those positions of power and influence, they're not going to make the right decisions, because they're going to be beholden to dollars and money and wealthy individuals and corporations. So that's part of this circle that we have to move from a vicious circle to a virtuous circle.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to go to our panelists shortly. I'm going to say a few words on behalf of our sponsor before we do. Skyfire Energy has been designing and installing solar PV systems for homeowners, business owners, utilities, and municipalities and First Nations since 2001. They're an employee-owned, certified B Corporation with offices in Calgary, Edmonton, Penticton, and Regina. Their staff is one of the most experienced and qualified teams in the industry, having completed many of the largest and most complex solar projects in Western Canada. Their vision is to bring the magic of solar power to the world for a stronger, healthier, and more sustainable global community. I'll also remind our viewers they can acquire a digital copy of Sustainable Calgary's State of Our City 2020 report on their website at sustainablecalgary.org, which is in our chat here someplace. Or again, you can get a physical copy at Page's Books on Kensington, so you can spill your coffee all over it like I just did. And then I've been pursuant to what we've been just talking about, I've been passed a message from Calgarians for Transit. Calgary City Council is voting on a new life-changing C-Train project, the Green Line LRT, at this Monday's council meeting, although it says, I guess the item is now scheduled to appear on Tuesday, June 16 at 3:45 p.m. The first leg of the Green Line will carry 65,000 people every day. This is a massive win for climate change mitigation, reducing up to 30,000 tons of GHGs per year, not to mention how it will connect our sprawling city and create a more equitable Calgary. Unfortunately, a small but organized group of influential individuals have paid for an opposition campaign to the Green Line, and we need your help. A growing group of transit users has come together under a grassroots volunteer campaign called Calgarians for Transit. We need, use, and support public transit and need to make our voices heard ahead of the June 16 vote. If you support public transit, there are 5 things you can do, and this will also be posted in the chat. So number 1, you can email City Council. You can visit the website yycfortransit.org to find more details. You can call City Council. Most councillors are working from home, but don't be afraid to leave a voicemail. That phone number's in the chat as well. There's a petition at yycfortransit.org. They're shooting for 1,500 signatures, so feel free to go and jump onto that and add to that. You can also share your support for the Green Line with the YYC for Transit Do-It-Yourself Toolkit on our website, or on their website, sorry. And you can also follow them on Facebook and Twitter at YYC for Transit for updates. And I'll just say that I personally have allocated some time tomorrow to voice my support to the city using the steps I've just mentioned, and I urge all within range of my voice to consider doing the same. Okay, so we're going to pull in one of our panelists. I don't see them up just yet, so I may go with a quick Facebook Live question. Oh, it looks like Sophia may be up here, so we'll get her rolling through here. Hi, Sophia.
Hi everyone. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thank you. Yeah, so I had a question basically about the just transition post COVID. So I'm the communications coordinator for the Climate Reality Project Canada, and we participated in the creation of the 6 principles for a just recovery, which you may have heard about. We also endorsed the principles, and hundreds of organizations across, from all fields across Canada helped create these principles, which demanded just recovery from the pandemic. And basically their 6 asks are to prioritize health, strengthen our social safety net, prioritize the needs of workers, build resilience to prevent future crises, build solidarity and equity across communities, and uphold Indigenous rights and work in partnership with Indigenous peoples. So these demands are very similar to the recommendations made in the State of the Union, State of the City, State of our City 2020 report. So my question to you is, how do you see some of these principles being implemented, not only in the city of Calgary, but also across all of Canada? You kind of touched upon this earlier, but I was wondering if you perhaps had any other ideas that touch upon these principles in particular.
Yeah. From my perspective, I think one of the things we could do the most quickly would be to shift welfare to a basic annual income. And that's not my idea. I stole it from my friend who's a policy expert in Ontario. But the idea is that, you know, we have all of these income supplements. If we shifted all of our income supplements right away to a basic annual income, you know, that would be bureaucratically a little bit tough, and some of them are quite good for the time being. But if we just took welfare and started with welfare, changing that to a basic annual income, I think welfare in Alberta, the last time I checked, was less than $500 a month. So it's like nowhere close to providing a livable income. So that's one of the things I would do. The other would be representation. It's a big deal that we don't have adequate representation, particularly in the government, but also in media and corporations. Who gets to sit at the table is who gets to speak. So we need our dialogue to be more inclusive. We need to be addressing the needs of all of our citizens. We need them represented. Those are the 2 I'd start with. I'll let Noel jump in. I might have another one.
I guess the one thing that I would say about it is I'm just thinking, referencing the Black Lives Matter again, and in particular some of the interventions there. But Barack Obama, I think, made an important point that I think is relevant here, is that the demonstrating is good, the coming up with good ideas and strategies is good, doing the research like we do is good, 6-point plans, but we've got to change our elected representatives who live in a democracy. we've got to be active somehow in the political process so that we're not always, that we have allies in those positions rather than fighting the politicians and the parties in power. So I think that somehow that's always a difficult question because all of the organizations that are doing all this work are really busy. A lot of people are cynical about politics. But I do think kind of Obama in the U.S. situation had it right that we have to get organized. We have to come up with solutions rather than just saying what's wrong, and we just have to get different people elected. Part of that is we have to elect different people so that they make better choices, and we have to fix the electoral system so it's possible to get better people elected. Because, like I mentioned in the indicator that we've been tracking, if 90% of the people that we send to Ottawa are conservatives and of a conservative bent, but they only get 65% of the vote. So we should be sending a lot more Liberals and NDP and Greens to Ottawa, and in particular, in a Green agenda. If there were proportional representation in country, I think the numbers were there would be something like 25 Greens in Parliament since from the last election. If we had a proportional, if the number of votes that they received were equal to the number of seats that they got. So we have to get the right people elected, and in part of that, or in part in concert with that, is making our electoral system and our democracy work again, because it's broken, right?
Thank you. That's it for me.
Okay, and Sophia, I'll just mention to you that I will be advocating to the Calgary Climate Hub to support the Just for Recovery for All initiative, and wherever I can try to gain some more gain some more turf here in Calgary for people promoting that. I do think this is a critical moment, and that this is exactly the sort of thing that we all need to be thinking about and doing. And I hope Sustainable Calgary will consider signing on as well. But thank you for your question, Sophia. Sounds like you almost wanted to say something there. Or are you okay?
Yeah, I was going to say I was going to include a link, but since you sent it, I encourage everyone to check out the website and sign on or promote it in your networks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that link is in the chat, and so you can go in there and take a look at it. And I mean, everything that I read in there makes sense. So it's worth everybody taking a look. Our next panelist is going to be Emen Fouli. She is the Alberta Regional Organizer for Climate Reality Canada. And I should mention that Climate Reality Canada has instigated a number of hubs across Canada, and the Calgary Climate Hub spawned from that, and so we're very grateful to that movement. And so, Emen, take it away.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for this opportunity to speak and for this wonderful report that you guys produced. It's excellent for me, coming as a scientist and coming from an educational system that was siloed, to see all these, an integration of the economy and politics and finance and energy and natural environment together is really important. And my dream, my wish, is to make this report mandatory reading for everyone, and especially all public servants and city councillors. And I don't know, how can we make this happen? How can we make sure it's read, it's understood, that the recommendations are taken seriously? And you mentioned earlier that it's turns into policy, but we then stops. There's no movement into action and intention. So how can we change that and get it into the budgets and get it actively worked on?
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in first there. I think it's a simple answer is just a lot of hard work. The report is done. We just have to get out there and talk to these people that you just mentioned and say, look, the report's there. Please read it. This is what the core of it is. This is why it's important. I think reaching as many, kind of Sustainable Calgary has kind of always tried to take the kind of the long view. It's like when we started 20 years ago, we said, well, if we could see things change in 20 years, that would be good. I think we could say the same thing again today. If we can see a change in 20 years, and that would be a good thing. And I think part of the rationale there is to, certainly be active in things like the Green Line, the immediate things that are in front of us, making our voice heard at the Green Line, but being consistently on the ground, kind of the ground game, people might call it that. We have to be consistently talking with Calgarians, whatever the issue of the day is, relating the work that we've done to that issue, and trying to provide a different lens to look at things that come up on a daily, regular basis in the news, that not to just look at it through that economic growth, capitalism, whatever kind of, that oil and gas is going to be with us forever, those lenses that we're typically used to looking at. So just trying to make those connections with people that, kind of like, have you thought about this in a different way? Here's some research that might help you think about it in a different way and ponder whether there's another way forward here. And that's kind of just a slow, long, getting as many people having those conversations with as many Calgarians as possible. I think we have had, at times, we've had some success with, like, I think we could take some of the benefit for the changes we have seen in the city in a small way. I think we've contributed to that. We've, over the time that we've started this report, we've certainly been invited to a lot of decision-making tables and consultation tables at the city, and I think we have had some impact. We've kind of got a cohort within City Hall of planners and architects and engineers who kind of know our stuff and are friendly, we'll say, and they try to put those kinds of ideas forward within the big mix of politics at City Hall, et cetera. But I guess that's the main thing, is just consistently trying to present a different message and making it relevant to what's on people's minds.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking sort of along the same lines, like letting government know they have our support, making elected officials feel comfortable making those decisions. But it's interesting because that means getting involved, and getting involved means time. And then during this COVID time, it's been interesting because we've seen that firsthand, that people have more time and they are getting involved, which then goes back around to the idea of like, well, can we have lives that are a little bit more balanced? But I think of things like a basic annual income, that would probably be scary for a government to implement, which they have done in the past when we have had trials with basic annual income. But the thing is that all of our evidence shows the benefits of a basic annual income. All of our evidence shows not only social benefits, it shows that the financial benefits outweigh the cost of it. And so we need to have that courage to do that. And so as a politician, I think they need to know that we're behind them. And then, I think we need to have more dialogue and more trust. And that's something we do get at in this report as well, which I thought was a really great section, Noel, on the idea that to make courageous decisions, we need trust.
Yeah.
And how to build that. I mean, we talk about that in the report. That's a complicated issue as well. And that, it relates to the state of dialogue. It relates to campaign financing. It relates to representation.
Yeah, I think that's just to say, just a point on the trust. I think it is an important element. It's kind of, some people talk about social capital, and we have to build social capital to be able to do things that has some good and bad connotations. But I think the idea of trust is one of those things that I think keeping front of mind to say, okay, are we building trust as we go through this process, as we challenge, advocate for different ideas? How are we interweaving a foundation of trust in our society? Because I think, again, it's kind of like, in a simple terms, it's like if this transition is going to be successful, to our neighbors, our politicians, the civil servants are going to have to be able to say to the average Canadian, we got your back. We need this transition. It's going to be tough. Things are going to change, but we got your back, which is kind of, again, in a big way we did with COVID. And I think that has to be at the core of transition. So that idea of how do we do all the things we have to do, and at the same time, hopefully trust is growing incrementally and across the board, so that when we get to the point where transition is possible, we've got enough of that trust that things are going to change. And I think in contrast to, say, the US, I think they're in such a bad position now because trust is so lacking in that society. We can do better, but in contrast, I think we're doing pretty well, but we need to build it more.
And in a few tangible ways, so we actually do present a budget every budget season and share what we've learned over the course of the year. We have written letters to the federal government saying, like, yes, please invest in a COVID relaunch strategy that prioritizes the environment and health and equity. yes, please go ahead with a national active transportation strategy. So those are some of the small tangible ways we've been doing that. And I agree with you. If we can get this into curriculum, that would be lovely.
Yeah, just the last thing, we did a citizens agenda about several years ago now, but it's still on our website. And the purpose of that was to take a look at the indicator report, got a whole bunch of people together and said, what are the key issues that come out of an analysis of these indicators? And what are the policies that can improve the problem indicators? And one of the dozen policies that we ended up putting into our citizens agenda report was sustainability infused throughout the K-12 curriculum. I think that still stands as a challenge to be able to achieve that.
That answer your question, Imen?
Yes, thank you very much. That's awesome.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thanks for the work you do for Climate Reality Canada.
You're welcome. Pleasure.
Okay. Okay, so our next and final panelist is Eileen Ling. She is with a group I quite like called Permeate Calgary, which is doing some good work on pulling together a Calgary Green New Deal. She also does work with a group called Hands On Growing that is, I believe, actively growing food on government land these days. So Eileen, take it away.
Hi, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed your talk. I like how these indicators all kind of tied these different systems and sectors together. I guess my question was, you guys talked about a mixed economy and this kind of issue of growth and equity. And I guess a lot of current business models are built on, like, they have to have profit, right? So I was wondering, in the context of just transition, is there any possibility within Calgary and Alberta to support or incentivize more community-based ownership models? So like co-ops is the most obvious example, but I wasn't really sure what your thoughts were on this.
Yeah, and actually co-ops were huge in Alberta, in rural areas back in the day. I actually did a report on success factors for co-ops in Alberta, and I think there is a lot of potential. So they've typically seen more success in rural areas and less in urban areas. But certainly the co-op housing model has been really great here. And I think I already said during this discussion that I think it can also be a really great option for affordable housing. So some of our co-ops are actually on leased city land. Noel, what would you add to that?
No, I think I would agree totally that co-ops is a huge opportunity to change the way their economy works. And I would also say with Celia that Alberta, I mean, we can look at the history of Alberta and demonstrate that we have a huge tradition in that. Celia mentioned some of the rural co-ops. So Alberta has more electrical generation or electrical distribution co-ops and gas co-ops in rural areas than any place in North America. The Calgary Co-op, MEC is a national brand, all those kinds of things, the housing co-ops that are in Calgary. So I think definitely that is one of the ways that we have to move in the economy is towards a cooperative model. Mondragon, if you're interested in this, there's no better kind of example to look up than Mondragon in Spain. If you just Google the Mondragon, maybe that's something that Steve could put out on the information after the seminar as well. But there's lots of examples of pretty established and pretty significantly sized cooperative models that work fantastic around the world. I think part of it has to, the little experience that I've had, I lived in a housing co-op for a while, and I think part of the thing with co-ops is that we need more people with that kind of social conscience to be educated in economics and business, to be able to make it work, because it's challenging, and you have to have a certain probably personality, a certain training to be confident to play in that pool, right? It's not, I mean, certainly, lots of people start up co-ops, but I think to make a dent and really take over a significant part of the economy and move towards cooperative economy or a social economy more generally, we need people who are going to be trained in how to make this work. and understand the current economy, but also understand the nuts and bolts of how you can make you can build cooperatives and make them work. So I think that is I'd say for young people looking at careers, that's an important thing, that we need more people who are capable of doing that are not just going to go into the capitalist economy and work for corporations they're not going to make as much money maybe, but they're going to do something good and they will make a good living and they'd probably be happier for it, maybe live longer.
Yeah. Some of the findings that I had was, so for example, in Alberta, there's now I could be wrong now, but at that time there was basically one lawyer who was really well versed in cooperative law. So that's a problem. But then there were other things that that really affected the success of cooperatives. And so for example, in urban cooperatives, what we found was that there were often people coming together with this sort of ideal of, we like the idea of cooperatives, but they weren't they weren't identifying how everyone would have skin in the game. So to really make it work, you really have to be quite committed. Like any small business, you have to be quite committed to getting it off the ground. And part of that is putting legally, what do you have at stake for this to succeed? And so that's why they've succeeded a lot in rural areas, because you have farmers who say well, we need to sell our wheat together, or we need to do our marketing together because we can't do it alone. And so that's their skin in the game. So then, yeah, we need to figure that out in urban environments. And we have in some cases, so with housing, that's a little clearer. Well, I get a house at the end, so I'm gonna work my butt off to get there. That was one thing. And then it's what Noel said, expertise.
Yeah, and I think the other, it brings this back to the politics again as well, because I think it's not the marginalization of the cooperative movement in economics didn't happen. I think it was made to happen by people in positions of power and politicians over a long period of time who put in place policies that favored corporations. One of the most egregious ones, I think, is the capital gains tax. So, it's a long story. There's a really good book by Linda McQuaig called The Trouble with Billionaires that would outline the total of this story. But essentially, mostly, with the Liberals and the Conservatives, very powerful people in the establishment in Canada became part of a small group of people who changed our economic system in the sense that capital gains, we pay half the tax on capital gains that we do on our own earned income. Maybe people know that, but that's one of the problems we have, is that it's much more lucrative for someone to buy stocks in the stock market, because when they make money, they're going to pay half what they pay for the money that they actually earn in working. And there's no need for that. That was put in place because of the machinations of powerful people and federal governments over a period of time. There's no reason we need to keep that. So we need more co-ops. We need more people trained in co-ops. We need more lawyers, all that sort of thing. And again, we have to balance the playing field. And to do that, we have to make the politics right and just and fix our democracy.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
So, Eileen, I don't know if you had another question there, but I feel like the next question that I want to ask of Sustainable Calgary, I wouldn't mind having your perspective from Permeate. Are you comfortable with that?
Sure. I guess with Permeate, we're a very young organization, both in terms of age and how long we've been around. And it's kind of interesting because a lot of people are interested in cooperative models and the potential for this to kind of scale in different directions. But I do agree with kind of the economic background. Like, a lot of people don't have that. There's a lot of environmentalists and engineers, people that are interested in permaculture and food growing, but it's really difficult to understand, even setting up a co-op, all the legal implications of certain decisions you make in your bylaws. So we're kind of slowly learning about it, but yeah.
Okay. What I want to ask, I guess looking right now in front of me on this Zoomcast, I am on behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub. I've got the excellent Noel Keough and I've got Celia here from Sustainable Calgary, and you're here from Permeate, and all of these are organizations that I've spent time with and know people on the ground and I quite like, and you know, we're all brothers and sisters in arms. And so I guess the question that I want to ask to you is, how do we seize this moment as climate and sustainability organizations and push our fellow organizations and push this city so that a just recovery is what happens here, and it's not just the regular players getting bucks thrown into their pockets from the regular players? Any ideas? How can we influence, I guess, is what I'm trying to really say.
I guess to me, there's a couple of things that come to mind at the provincial and city level. I really probably don't mean it, but I think I almost feel like the provincial level is kind of a lost cause for the time being. But
sure,
there's more hope at the city and the federal level. But I think at the federal level, the earlier speaker, the 6 steps. Sorry, I can't remember people's names, but I'm getting old. But the 6 steps, I think something like that initiative at a national level, it's timely now. The government is in a space where they feel like they can spend money, and that's okay. So I think we have an opportunity to present some really radical ideas for a transition at a federal level, and we need to organize. So I think, you know, Sustainable Calgary certainly will be looking at those 6 agenda items and joining, and whatever coalition that, you know, just doing the work of trying to make a significant coalition that's going to have an impact on the decision making. And I think, again, I go back to the budgets, not just policy, but get the Liberal government to change their budgets to support these things. And then at a local level, to say the same thing. I think one of the things that I think would be really important to do, not saying Sustainable Calgary is going to lead the charge, but we're certainly interested in being part of it, is that we need to get City Council to change radically the budget this fall. That when they produce a budget, it's got to be different. And I think we need to get organized and have lots of different organizations that are pushing in the same direction, that we need to come up with an alternative budget, at least the outlines of a budget, the major moves, major changes in a budget, and present a kind of a common front to City Council because, like I say, we've got great policy, but we never do anything about it because Council doesn't allocate the dollars to do anything about it. And one of the most egregious ones, or the easy, not easy pickings, but one of the biggest item on the council budget is transportation. And so again, I think this is where we've got a huge opportunity to say, stop building roads, take that money and put it to other places. Because what we see time and time again is governments argue, well, if we can get some money from the feds, if we can get money from the province, we can dig up a grant or two, maybe we can do some LRT, or if we can find a few dollars, we'll build a bike lane. But we've got to say to government, this is the biggest item. There's hundreds of millions of dollars in there. Take tens of millions of dollars out of transportation, stop building interchanges, and put it towards active transportation. They can do that. It's not like they've got to find new money. They've just got to decide, we're going to change the line items. And I think, so locally, I would, for both federally and locally, I would say we've got to get at the budget. We got to organize to do that, have a common front federally and provincially for this upcoming budget. And I think, or the city, and I think to me, the most important line item there is transportation, because it's a lot of money, and we can be doing a lot better things with that money that's already allocated.
Yeah. I guess the other thing I would add to that is, you know, for the federal government has announced that they're going to change the infrastructure budget to adapt to COVID, which means creating more space for people, pathways, sidewalks, etc. But we're at a time now where things can change very quickly. And so in the short term, I would say write a letter to your federal representative, write a letter to relevant ministers, and say that you support a relaunch strategy that not only allows space for people to move around and distance during a pandemic, but that makes our communities healthier and more environmentally friendly and more equitable than when the pandemic started. So that's one thing that's sort of very short term. Noel mentioned the budget, that's in the fall. And then in 2021, we've got an election. So let's start to create the agenda for what the election issues are going to be and what city we want to have in 2022.
Yeah, I think at the city level, it's interesting with the elections, because they're always, we know when they're coming, So I've always thought it'd be a great idea if we could get together collectively as not-for-profits that have, this common causes and concerns, and say, let's kind of suspend our normal operations for a month and put all of our energy, our personal collective energies into the elections, because that makes so much. It would make all of our agendas so much better if we had good people that supported what we wanted to do elected. I think there was something else I was going to say there, slipped my mind. Maybe it'll come back to me in a few minutes.
Eileen, what are your thoughts?
I guess one thought I had is the idea of social innovation investment is, I think, gaining more traction, especially with governments. Like in Toronto and stuff, there's a lot of work being done. And one thing I've been thinking about is how can we start to build on that in Calgary? Because I know like Mount Royal has a program. I'm not sure about the UFC, but I think the city even has some stuff going on. But how can we network together to like further build those connections so that we can kind of move in a more unified way? And also on that investment category, I think there's potentially some opportunities there.
Yeah,
Great.
if I can, Steve, make a plug for the next event that we're going to be part of. That's right in line with that. We're going to be talking to Civic YYC. I think it is a webinar that they have next week, and this is a group of people who are interested in social innovation. So that's we're pretty excited about that as well, and trying to plug into that group of people. So I think that the point you make, Eileen, is great. I think we need to be active in that space as well, because that's where all the energy in Calgary is going to be over the next few years, because we do have to diversify, and a lot of it is going to come out of that kind of innovating groups that are really people that are really interested in innovation. So yeah, I agree.
Excellent. Okay, I guess we went a little longer than I tried to get it down to. I have two guests this time, and so that ends up happening. We do have a decent amount of questions on the Facebook Live, so I don't know if you guys would be comfortable going on to Facebook and addressing some of those questions sometime over the next couple of days, maybe, or something along those lines. It's I can get the link to you, and we can get that. I usually go on right after and answer a few questions, but. Before we go, I'll remind our viewers they can acquire a digital copy of Sustainable Calgary's State of Our City 2020 report on their website at sustainablecalgary.org, and Pages Books for the hard copy. Celia and Noel, thank you so much for coming on tonight, and thanks so much for what you do. It's important work.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
and right
Steve.
back at you.
It's a great format. You're a great host.
Oh,
Yes.
thanks. I try. So on next week's show, we'll have Linda Cody, the Executive Director of the Pembina Institute, Canada's foremost think tank on energy and environmental issues. That's going to be a good one. You don't want to miss it. So we'll include the RSVP link in the chat. Again, if you like this Thursday night broadcast, we want you to know it wouldn't be possible without our excellent sponsor, Skyfire Energy. They've paved the way for solar in Western Canada and will certainly be a big part of our future. I should also mention the Calgary Climate Hub. If you like what you saw here, they've put me to work on this, and I can tell you that if climate is something that ticks away at you and bothers you, you need to be a part of a group like the Calgary Climate Hub. Permeate Calgary does great work too, and Sustainable Calgary does great work. But the key is that if you're not involved with a group doing something and you're just by yourself, that's where despair comes in. So find yourself a good climate group, and I heartily recommend the Calgary Climate Hub as a group that legitimately moves the ball on climate. You can go to calgaryclimatehub.ca to become a member, and as well as to donate to the hub. So both of those things are very welcome. I want to thank our volunteers Shay, Joan, and Paul for their help on getting this out to you tonight. And again, thanks again to Sustainable Calgary. Finally, I'd just like to thank all of you for tuning in and caring about the right things. Good night for now, and let's get to work.
Good night.
Good night, guys. Thanks again.
You too.